The glass conference room felt smaller than usual. I was explaining our revised timeline when Mark cut me off mid-sentence. His voice carried across the table like he owned every word in the room. Emily struggles with client pressure, he said, looking straight at the senior leadership team. I think it's best if I handle this account moving forward. My face burned. 6 people stared at me like I'd just been exposed. Then Mr. Harrison, our biggest client, cleared his throat. Actually, he said slowly, we specifically requested Emily for this project. The room went silent. Mark smiled, but his eyes promised something darker. I realized in that moment this wasn't a mistake. It was deliberate. He'd planned this exact scene, counting on me to stay quiet while he rewrote my reputation in front of witnesses who mattered. My hands stayed flat on the table. I didn't defend myself. Not yet. Because something in Harrison's tone told me the story wasn't over. For weeks earlier, everything looked different. I was the one staying late, fixing the problems Mark created during the day. He'd promise clients impossible deadlines, then disappear. I'd smooth it over with calls after dinner, revisions at midnight, apologies that weren't mine to make. I told myself loyalty mattered. That good work would eventually speak louder than office politics. That Mark would notice I was holding things together and finally give me credit where it counted. Then I saw the project recap he sent to leadership. My name wasn't on it. Not once. Every solution I'd designed, every crisis I'd managed, every client relationship I'd saved was listed under his contributions. I read it 3 times looking for some mistake, some oversight. There was none. He'd erased me systematically like I was never there. That's when I started paying attention. A coworker named Patricia pulled me aside near the water cooler. Her voice dropped low. Mark has a habit, she said carefully. He protects his position by making other people smaller. You're not the first. I brushed it off. Patricia had been here 15 years and still hadn't moved up. Maybe she was just bitter. Then I overheard Mark in the break room with 2 managers. Emily's too soft for leadership, he said, laughing. Great worker bee, but she doesn't have the spine for client-facing roles. They agreed. I stood in the hallway holding my coffee cup frozen. He wasn't just taking credit. He was shaping a narrative about who I was, building a story that would follow me through every meeting, every performance review, every opportunity that came up. I realized Mark wasn't protecting his position from competition. He was protecting it from me specifically. I started noticing patterns. In meetings, Mark presented my solutions as if they were his own. Clients thanked him for ideas I'd drafted at 2 in the morning. When I tried to clarify, he'd smile and talk over me gently, redirecting attention before anyone noticed the correction. It was surgical. He never yelled. Never argued. He just made me invisible in rooms where I'd done all the work. Then I found the email thread. Mark had intentionally excluded me from a client communication chain. He told the client I was unavailable when I'd been sitting 20 feet away. He wanted them to see him as the only reliable contact. I printed the emails, dated and time-stamped, and filed them in a folder on my desktop. I didn't know why yet. I just knew something felt wrong enough to document. When our key client threatened to leave, Mark panicked privately but told leadership he had everything under control. He called me into his office and assigned me the cleanup work. Fix this quietly, he said. But don't contact the client directly. I need to maintain the relationship. I nodded. I worked through the weekend rebuilding their deliverables, correcting errors Mark had made during presentations he'd insisted on leading. The solutions were technical, detailed, the kind of work that required understanding their business model inside and out. By Monday morning I had everything ready. Then the client bypassed Mark entirely and emailed me. Emily, we need to talk. Can you call me directly? I stared at the message for a full minute. Mark's instruction echoed in my head. Don't contact the client directly. But the client was asking. I made the call. Mr. Harrison's voice was calm but firm. I don't trust Mark anymore, he said. I trust you. You've been the one actually solving problems while he takes credit in meetings. I'm not blind. I kept my tone professional. I didn't badmouth Mark. I didn't complain. I just walked Harrison through the solutions step by step, explaining what went wrong and how I'd fixed it. He listened without interrupting. When I finished, he thanked me. Keep doing what you're doing, he said. We'll be watching. I documented the call immediately. Time, Date, topics discussed, outcomes. I forwarded Harrison a summary email, copying Mark to keep everything transparent. 2 hours later, Mark scheduled a sudden performance check-in for the next morning. No agenda. No warning. Just a calendar invite that landed in my inbox like a stone dropping into still water. Mark's office smelled like expensive coffee and leather cleaner. He sat behind his desk, fingers steepled, expression concerned in that practiced way managers use when they're about to rewrite reality. "Emily," he began, "I think you're misreading some situations. You're a strong individual contributor, but client-facing responsibility requires a different skill set. I'm protecting you by managing those relationships myself." I didn't argue. I nodded slowly like I was absorbing wisdom. Inside, I was recording every word in my memory. He leaned forward. "You should be grateful I'm shielding you from that pressure. Not everyone gets this kind of support." Thanked him. I left his office knowing exactly what was happening. He was building a paper trail, creating a narrative where I was incapable, where his control was protective rather than competitive. I was being set up. That night I stopped reacting emotionally. I opened a new folder on my laptop and labeled it clearly. I started organizing emails by date, saving deliverables with version histories, documenting every client interaction with timestamps and outcomes. I wasn't building a case. I was building clarity. I needed to see the pattern laid out in front of me, undeniable and clean. Over the next 2 weeks I noticed something else. Without me quietly covering his mistakes, Mark started failing in small, visible ways. He missed a deadline because he didn't understand the client's technical requirements. He presented outdated information in a strategy meeting because he hadn't read the updated brief I'd sent. Each time I stayed quiet. I didn't correct him publicly. I just watched the cracks form in his carefully maintained image. During the next client meeting, Mark confidently presented a solution based on assumptions he hadn't verified. I watched Mr. Harrison's face change. Confusion first, then concern. Harrison glanced at me. I kept my expression neutral. When Mark finished, Harrison asked a clarifying question that exposed the gap in Mark's understanding. Mark fumbled. He tried to redirect. He promised to follow up. Harrison nodded slowly, but I could see trust draining from the room. After the meeting, Harrison lingered near the door. "Can we follow up on this privately?" he asked me. I told him I'd coordinate with Mark and send over the correct information. Harrison smiled tightly. "I'd prefer to work with you directly on this." I felt the ground shift. The client was choosing me over my boss in a way that couldn't be ignored. Harrison's follow-up email was direct. "I feel more comfortable working with Emily on the technical details. Mark can stay involved at the strategic level, but I'd like Emily as my primary contact moving forward." I read it twice, then forwarded it to Mark immediately, keeping everything professional and transparent. No games. No power plays. Just facts. Mark's response came an hour later. "Let's discuss." In person, his friendliness evaporated. He didn't yell. He just went cold. His emails became clipped. He stopped inviting me to planning meetings. He started seeking senior leadership on minor communications, creating a paper trail that framed me as needing oversight. I recognized the strategy immediately. If I succeeded with Harrison, Mark would take credit. If I failed, he'd have documentation showing I was the problem. I kept working. I kept documenting. I let him build his case while I built mine. In meetings, Mark started interrupting me unnecessarily. He'd correct details that didn't need correcting, making jokes at my expense that landed just softly enough to seem harmless. "Emily's very thorough," he'd say, smiling. "Sometimes too thorough for client timelines." People laughed. I didn't respond. I let it play out. Coworkers noticed. Patricia caught my eye across the conference table once, her expression saying what we both knew. Mark was threatened. When someone feels their position slipping, they don't get quieter. They get louder, more visible, more controlling. 2 weeks later, leadership announced a formal client review. They wanted to assess account health, team performance, strategic alignment. Mark's face lit up when he heard. This was his moment to reframe everything, to position himself as the hero managing difficult circumstances. I knew this review could end my career at the company. I also knew I had every email, every deliverable, every timestamp that told the real story. Mark prepared for the review like he was preparing for trial. He rehearsed talking points. He built slides highlighting his leadership. He scheduled practice runs with colleagues who didn't know the full story. I heard him through the conference room wall, framing me as someone who needed guidance and struggled with confidence under pressure. He was setting the stage to sideline me permanently. I didn't prepare a defense. I didn't build counterslides. I just organized my documentation folder, labeled everything clearly, and waited. The night before the review I barely slept. I kept thinking about Patricia's warning, about Harrison's trust, about every late night I'd spent fixing problems that were never mine to fix. I thought about how easy it would be to walk away, to find another job, to avoid the confrontation entirely. Then I remembered Mark's voice in the break room. Too soft for leadership. I decided I was done being soft. The glass conference room felt smaller than usual. I was explaining our revised timeline when Mark cut me off mid-sentence. His voice carried across the table like he owned every word in the room. "Emily struggles with client pressure," he said, looking straight at the senior leadership team. "I think it's best if I handle this account moving forward." My face burned. 6 people stared at me like I'd just been exposed. Then Mr. Harrison cleared his throat. "Actually," he said slowly, "we specifically requested Emily for this project. She's the only one who truly understands our needs." Mark's smile froze. Leadership shifted in their seats. One executive leaned forward. "Can you elaborate, Mr. Harrison?" Harrison looked at me, then at Mark. "Emily's been the one solving our problems for months. I'd like to continue working with her directly." Silence filled the room. Mark laughed it off, but his voice had an edge. "Of course we can accommodate that." The executive made a note. "Let's schedule a follow-up. Emily, would you be available to walk us through your work on this account?" I nodded. The power had shifted. The follow-up meeting happened 3 days later. Just me, 2 executives, and Mr. Harrison on video call. No Mark. I didn't accuse anyone. I didn't complain. I simply walked through the work chronologically. I showed the original client brief, the solutions I'd designed, the timeline of communications. I explained each crisis and how it was resolved, citing specific dates and deliverables. Harrison confirmed every detail. "Emily's work saved our relationship with your company," he said clearly. "Without her we would have left months ago." One executive asked for documentation. I'd already prepared a clean, organized folder. Every email, every revision history, every client interaction time-stamped and categorized. They reviewed it in silence. The truth didn't need emotion. It spoke louder than any accusation I could have made. When the meeting ended, the senior executive looked at me carefully. "Thank you for your transparency," she said. "We'll be in touch." Leadership requested my complete project files. I provided everything, organized by month, client, and outcome. They spent a week reviewing. I heard nothing. Then Patricia told me what was happening behind closed doors. Leadership had started asking questions. They'd noticed Mark's name on work he couldn't explain. They'd found patterns of him taking credit for solutions he didn't understand. Other team members were being interviewed quietly. Mark's authority was cracking. One morning Mark stopped by my desk. His tone was suddenly friendly, almost desperate. "Emily," he said, smiling too wide. "I think there's been some miscommunication. I've always valued your contributions. Let's grab coffee and clear the air." I thanked him and said I was buried in client work. He stood there for a moment, unsure how to respond when the usual script didn't work. Then he walked away. 2 days later I got a LinkedIn message from a competing firm. They'd heard about my work with Harrison. They wanted to talk. The competing firm offered me a senior role, better title, significant raise. They didn't just want me. They wanted the client relationships I'd built. I didn't accept immediately. I asked for time to consider. Word travels fast in our industry. Within 48 hours Mark heard about the offer. I knew because his behavior changed overnight. He stopped undermining me in meetings. He started praising my work publicly, telling leadership I was essential to the team. He scheduled a one-on-one and came prepared with vague promises. "We're looking at promotions next quarter," he said. "I'm putting your name forward. I always have been." I listened. I nodded. I didn't believe a word. The desperation in his voice told me everything. He'd built his reputation on my work, and now I was about to walk away with the proof. For the first time since I'd started working for him, I had the power. And he knew it. Mark cornered me near the elevators, suddenly supportive in a way that felt rehearsed. "Emily, I need your help with the Harrison account transition," he said. "You've built such a strong relationship. I can't do this without you." It was the first time he'd ever admitted needing me. The first time he'd acknowledged my value out loud. I looked at him carefully. His eyes were searching my face for weakness, for the old version of me who would have stayed quiet and helped him anyway. "I'll think about it," I said. His jaw tightened. I stepped into the elevator. As the doors closed, I saw his reflection in the steel. He looked smaller than I remembered. That night I made my decision. Not out of anger. Not out of revenge. Out of clarity. I'd spent 2 years covering for someone who'd never once covered for me. I was done. When I gave my notice, I kept it professional. 2 weeks, standard transition, no drama. Leadership called me in immediately. They asked what it would take to keep me. I told them honestly. I didn't want Mark's job. I didn't want an apology. I wanted to work somewhere my contributions were visible and valued. They nodded. They understood. Mark claimed he could manage the transition smoothly. He told leadership he'd maintain the client relationships without issue. I didn't argue. I just kept working through my final 2 weeks, documenting everything, responding to emails, staying professional. Then Mr. Harrison called me directly. "We heard you're leaving," he said. "Where are you going?" I told him about the new firm. He was quiet for a moment. Would they be open to taking on new clients? I paused. "I believe so." Harrison didn't hesitate. "We'd like to follow you." I told him I'd connect him with the right people. I didn't celebrate. I didn't gloat. I just forwarded the introduction and let the decision be his. My last day was quiet. No farewell party. No speeches. I packed my desk, returned my badge, and walked out through the lobby I'd entered 2 years earlier. 3 days later, I started at the new firm. The office was smaller, but my title was real. My voice was heard in meetings. My name was on the work I did. Harrison's account transferred officially within the month. He told my new boss I was the only reason he'd stayed with my old company as long as he did. I didn't need him to say it, but it mattered. Back at the old firm, things were unraveling. Without me covering gaps, Mark's other accounts started showing cracks. Deadlines were missed. Clients complained. Leadership asked questions he couldn't answer. I heard about it through Patricia, who texted me updates like she was narrating a slow-motion collapse. I didn't feel victorious. I felt relieved. Mark failed to retain another major client 2 months after I left. Leadership launched an internal review to understand what was happening. They interviewed team members. They reviewed project records. They found the pattern I'd lived through but never reported. Credit taking. Blame shifting. Dependence on junior staff to cover his mistakes while he performed competence in meetings. It wasn't a scandal. It was just truth, plain and undeniable. Mark was quietly removed from key accounts and reassigned to internal projects. No dramatic firing. No public shaming. Just consequences that matched the reality of his work. Patricia sent me the news with a single emoji. I read it twice, then closed my phone. I didn't feel like I'd won. I felt like I'd survived something that shouldn't have happened in the first place. That night, I thought about the day Mark said I couldn't handle clients. I thought about Harrison asking for me by name. The evidence spoke for itself during the review. Emails showed Mark claiming work he hadn't done. Version histories revealed who'd actually written the strategies he'd presented. Client feedback named me specifically as the person who'd solved their problems. Leadership couldn't ignore it. They didn't want a scandal, so they handled it quietly. Mark kept his job but lost his authority. The people who'd once deferred to him started questioning his decisions. The reputation he'd built on borrowed work crumbled when the borrowing stopped. I wasn't there to see it. I only heard pieces through former colleagues who reached out. Some apologized for not speaking up sooner. Some asked how I'd stayed so calm. I told them the truth. I didn't plan revenge. I just stopped protecting someone who'd never protected me. The rest happened on its own. Documentation didn't lie. Clients didn't forget. And eventually, patterns became visible to people who'd been too busy to notice. Mark reached out 6 weeks after I left. The email was brief, professional, almost humble. He asked if I'd be willing to help smooth things over with a client who was considering leaving. He said he understood if I was too busy, but he'd appreciate any guidance I could offer. I stared at the message for a long time. Part of me wanted to ignore it. Part of me wanted to write back with everything I'd held in for 2 years. Instead, I replied with one paragraph. I thanked him for reaching out. I explained that I was focused on my new role and couldn't take on additional consulting work. I wished him well. I meant it. I wasn't angry anymore. I was just done. His response never came. I didn't expect one. Sometimes the loudest statement is silence. Sometimes letting go is the only answer that matters. 3 months into my new role, I led my first major client presentation. My name was on the slides. My ideas were credited to me in front of executives who mattered. When the client thanked me directly, no one redirected the credit. No one interrupted to reframe the narrative. I realized how much energy I'd spent fighting to stay visible in a place designed to keep me small. At my old company, I'd been an invisible safety net. Here, I was a professional doing work that people valued openly. The difference wasn't just respect. It was freedom. I could focus on solving problems instead of managing perceptions. I could trust that my contributions would be acknowledged instead of erased. I didn't have to document everything defensively. I could just work. That night, I thought about Patricia's warning. About Mark's pattern of making people smaller. About how many talented people probably left that company believing they weren't good enough. I started mentoring younger professionals who reached out through industry networks. I recognized the signs early. The self-doubt. The overwork. The confusion when their contributions disappeared in meetings. I told them what I'd learned. Document everything, not for revenge but for clarity. Stay professional even when others aren't. Let the work speak. And know when walking away isn't quitting. Sometimes it's the only way to protect what you've built. One woman told me she'd been covering for her manager for 18 months. She thought loyalty would be rewarded. I asked her one question. Does he acknowledge your work or does he perform it as his own? She went quiet. A month later she gave notice. She sent me a message afterward. You were right. The new job sees me. I saved that message. It reminded me why the truth mattered. I'm sitting in my office now, looking at the city through glass that doesn't feel like a cage. My name is on the door. My work is visible. I'm no longer fighting to exist in rooms where I'm doing the hardest work. Sometimes I think about that conference room, about Mark cutting me off mid-sentence, about Harrison requesting me by name. I think about the moment I realized I had a choice. I could defend myself loudly and probably lose. Or I could build proof quietly and let the truth do the work. I chose the second path. Not because I wanted revenge. Because I wanted peace. Mark tried to make me small. The truth made him irrelevant. I didn't ruin his career. I just stopped protecting it. And that was enough. The best victories aren't loud. They're the moments when you stop needing permission to be seen. This story wasn't about yelling at my boss or fighting back at work. It was about staying calm, staying smart, and letting the truth do the talking. Sometimes the best revenge at the office isn't quitting or snapping. It's proving your worth where they least expect it. If you've ever been talked over, doubted, or treated like you didn't belong, especially by someone who had power over you, then this story was for you. Like this video if this story felt real to you. Subscribe for more workplace revenge stories, where bullies lose control, effort gets noticed, and women rise without asking permission.